Good evening. Thank you for joining us for the Digital Dialogue series. We're going to get started in just a moment. If you would like to listen to this in Spanish, there is an interpretation button at the bottom that looks like a globe, and you can listen in Spanish. Welcome. We're just going to wait one more minute while folks log on, and then we'll get started. Okay, we will get started. It is 5:35. Good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. And welcome to the Digital Dialogue series, Co-Learning to Build a Good Food System. If you would like to listen to this webinar in Spanish, please click the button at the bottom of your screen that looks like a globe and select Spanish. My name is Molly Riordan. I am the Good Food Purchasing Coordinator for the City of Philadelphia's Department of Public Health in the Division of Chronic Disease and Injury Prevention, which is also known as Get Healthy Philly. At Get Healthy Philly, we believe that all people should live to their fullest potential in environments that allow them to grow and thrive, and that progress only happens when we treat all people with dignity, care, and respect. As part of its efforts, Get Healthy Philly is working to create a sustainable, healthy, fair local food system, or what we call a good food economy, and acknowledges that dismantling the systems of oppression is a foundational move to achieving our vision of a just food system. Tonight is the fourth in a series of 6 conversations with community and civic leaders whose work reimagines our food system in Philadelphia and in cities and rural areas across the country to answer the question, what does it take to build a good food system for all right now at this point in time? These intercity digital dialogues showcase progress in developing a good food economy through anti-racist strategies and inspire all of us to envision and work toward an equitable food system. This series is a partnership with the Free Library of Philadelphia's Division of Cultural and Civic Engagement, and I'd like to thank my co-organizer, Suzanna Urminska, who's the exhibitions curator at the division. Susanna is managing tech this evening, so if you have any tech issues or questions, you can contact her in the chat. She'll be monitoring that. Funding for the series comes from the Sodium Reduction in Communities program of the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, from the Philadelphia Department of Public Health, and from the Free Library. This event was originally scheduled for an in-person event at the Heim Center for Civic and Cultural Engagement, which is providing for Spanish interpretation tonight and every night during this series. Tonight we have the honor of speaking with 2 people who work at the intersection of the food economy and food insecurity, and whose short-range work on eliminating food insecurity is informed by a desire to recenter control of the food economy among those who have been underserved by the current food system. From the outside, their work may look like food access, but instead it is an effort toward food sovereignty. La Via Campesina, the international peasants movement, states that food sovereignty is the right of peoples to define their own food and agriculture, to protect and regulate domestic agricultural production and trade in order to achieve sustainable development objectives, to determine the extent to which they want to be self-reliant, and to restrict the dumping of products in their markets. Food sovereignty does not negate trade, but rather it promotes the formulation of trade policies and practices that serve the rights of people to safe, healthy, and ecologically sustainable production. In 2003, in an article for Food First, professor and food security activist Peter Rossett wrote, "Food sovereignty goes beyond the concept of food security, which has been stripped of any real meaning. Food security means that every child, woman, and man must have the certainty of having enough to eat each day. But the concept says nothing about where that food comes from or how it's produced. To achieve genuine food security, people in rural areas must have access to productive land and receive prices for their crops that allow them to make a decent living. Thus, food sovereignty, with its emphasis on local markets and economics, is essential to fighting hunger and poverty." I'm looking forward to digging into the difference between security and sovereignty tonight, and I'm proud to introduce our speakers who have a lot to say on this and other topics. A-dae Briones is the Director of Programs, Native Agriculture and Food Systems for the First Nations Development Institute. A-dae worked for the University of Arkansas School of Law Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative while earning her LLM degree in Food and Agricultural Law. Her thesis was on the Food Safety Modernization Act as it applied to the federal tribal relationship. She wrote extensively about food safety, the produce safety rule and tribes, and the protection of tribal traditional foods. A U.S. Fulbright scholar, A-dae received her Bachelor of Arts in Public Policy from Princeton University and received a law doctorate from Arizona State University's College of Law, in addition to her LLM degree in Food and Agricultural Law from the University of Arkansas. Aziza Young, or Chef Z, is a Philadelphia-based chef and hunger activist. She is one of the co-founders of Everybody Eats, a chef-led food drive that gives out free meals and essential goods to Philadelphians as a direct response to COVID-19 pandemic. An entrepreneur, former Chopped contestant, and mother of 5, Chef Z is a personal chef in Philadelphia, whose trunk is often packed with bagged lunches to give to those in need. A-dae, welcome. Aziza, welcome. Thank you both for being here. A-dae, I'd like to start with you. Could you please tell us a little bit more about your work at First Nations Development Institute and how your work has shifted since the pandemic struck?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for having me tonight. And Gwetsi say hopa to everyone in the audience. It's an honor to be in your homes. And I welcome your thoughts and comments, and I hope our discussion tonight inspires you in some way, even a little bit. Oftentimes we do these things in our homes and it's so mundane and we're probably all zoomed out. So I just thank you for taking some time with us today. And you know, before I get into the meat of what I have to say, there's always a question. Like, we're talking about food systems in Philadelphia. What the heck does an Indigenous person who's all the way in California and who works nowhere near Philadelphia have to do with this discussion? And hopefully I'll, in my words, I'll be able to make those connections. But you know, we began this discussion talking about a just and equitable food system and what that means. And I think when we look at the food system in America, we're all pretty much part of the same food system, right? We've come to know the McDonald's on every corner. We've come to know the staple grocery items that we can find in any store in America. We can even go to farmers markets and still find the same Cherokee tomato, that's the heirloom tomato. I mean, our food system is very much connected. And so at our work at the Indigenous Food System and Agriculture Initiative at First Nations, we focus our efforts on Indigenous food systems, which some will call hyper-localized systems. So when we think about a local food system, you think about the Indigenous community in that food system. They probably co-evolved with their environment and co-evolved with their land. And so their food sources are based on that land and in that environment, which means that you probably can't find any of those foods in any other microclimate or climate in America or even the world, because they're very much unique to those places that we come from. And so what does that mean when we take that relationship with the relationship of the American food system? And I think there's no other stark example than when COVID hit. So if you think about the American food system, the modern American food system, and you think about the long supply chain that any food product has to go through, and more than likely some of these products are not produced in our own country. They trek miles and miles and miles to get into the different places. Well, Indian country is probably outside of that food chain. So all those trekking of food miles, you probably have to go another 75 to 90 miles to get to an Indian community. So a lot of the folks that we work with end up having to travel at least 50 miles to get a gallon of milk, for example. And so during COVID, when we saw massive supply chain disruptions, whether it be around beef, whether it be around dairy, whether it be around fresh food, products like vegetables or fruit, our communities were affected because you had food shortages. You can no longer drive the 50 miles to get to a grocery store and have supply actually there. And so what happened is you have a mass response by not only the government, but philanthropic entities where they just started finding surpluses of food, whether that be in Arkansas, whether that be in North Dakota, and shipping those food sources to the communities that had food shortages. And that was the response. The internal response was more of a resiliency response, I call it, in that the people in these communities were looking to secure seeds. We're looking to figure out how to butcher their own animals. We're looking at what food resources indigenous communities ate even before contact. And so to me, that was the stark example of the difference between food security and food sovereignty. And it was an external reaction, which was all based on food security, and an community internal reaction, which was all based on food sovereignty. And so there's a lot of lessons that we can take from those reactions during COVID, but we have so much to say, and I want to give plenty of time for Aziza to talk to.
Thank you for the introduction to your work, and I'm glad that you brought up the dumping of emergency food that ended up in the communities that maybe was not necessarily asked for from the outside. So I want to get to that in a little bit. Chef Z, I know that you also saw a shift in your focus as a response to the pandemic. Can you tell us a little bit about how Everybody Eats got started and what the effort's been doing in Philadelphia?
Hi, everyone. Thank y'all for tuning in, and thank you for having me tonight. It's a pleasure. Thank you very much. Everybody Eats actually started after the riots happened. The founder, Stephanie, she said she was watching the news and she felt like she needed to do something. So she called up a few of us, and of course we said yes, because earlier in the pandemic, I started cooking for low-income families, senior citizens, and non-ambulatory people. And I called on Steph, and Steph came in the kitchen and cooked up free meals for our senior citizens, for our low-income families, and our non-ambulatory people. But it was after the riots, it really, being as though we was already in a pandemic, A pandemic was already happening. Now, people riot at the markets, the drugstores. A lot of people, period, did not have the food that they needed, did not have the items that they needed. And most of them were senior citizens. You know, when we do our Everybody Eats pop-ups, about 90% of the people that are in line are our senior citizens, you know, because they're not that middle-aged people and young people aren't don't have food insecurities and aren't under the poverty level, but about 28% of our senior citizens here in the city of Philadelphia are below the poverty level. I was working with the organization between March to June that works with senior citizens below the poverty level, and about 98% of their people that they work with about 800 people. About 98% of those people live under the poverty level. You know, well, just seniors, and I'm just talking about senior citizens. There's no there and yes, there are programs out there that help out our community. We've reached out to them, and they actually work with us. We get food from them to help distribute it into the community, because a lot of people don't have access to transportation, or sick. Right now, we don't want our senior citizens, especially going out when there's still COVID going on out there. I go to the market for my mother, and my mother is 64. 64. But if you're looking at the average senior, and I don't mean to focus on seniors, but they're getting hit very hard right now. You know, they're getting hit very, very hard right now. They don't have the same motive. They don't have the same what's the word I'm looking for? They don't have the same can't think of it. Access. They don't have access to a lot of things that we have access to. They're not as mobile as we are. So we need to get out there and help them. And not just with food, but with essentials as well. With our last pop-up this past Saturday, we had diapers for people that have children, and a lot of seniors take care of their grandchildren. And they was like, well, do you have diapers for us? And it's just so sad to see our older generation going through this. They've already been through enough. Right now, they should be relaxing. They should be enjoying, you know, the fruits of their labor. But instead, a lot of them are not. A lot of them are starving. A lot of them don't have the means to a lot of things, and it's very sad, and it hurts to see, you know. So what we have been doing, of course, is giving out food and essentials. This time we were almost out of food within a half hour after we pulled up, and after we set up. We started 10 minutes early, and by 2:19, most of the food was gone. We still had boxes of milk and eggs and veggies and some cheese, but all of the essentials were gone. And like I said, majority of the food was gone. We give out food for your pantry, like cans of canned food, because it lasts longer. And it just shows how many people right now need help, you know, need those things, and don't have access to go out and get them. Like, people, we need to come to them. You know, we have to come to them, and that's what Everybody Eats does as well. We go to different parts of the city. Instead of people having to come to us, we go to them so that we can help that community out this week, and then this community out in 2 weeks. And that's what needs to happen, you know, especially if we want our economy if we want our people to be food secure, then those things need to happen.
Yeah. And so you brought this up, and I think that this is good. You know, Everybody Eats is is one effort among many efforts. And A-dae, I know that that's also, like, the work that you're doing is one part of other efforts that are happening in the tribal communities. And either one of you, whoever wants to start on this, I'm wondering, what have you heard about people's experiences with accessing food at this time? Are their needs being met? Is there unmet demand? Are they satisfied with what they're getting? Or A-dae, as you said, there's a different thought about resiliency. So I'm just wondering if you've gotten any feedback from the folks that you've been seeing coming out.
Yeah, well, before I answer that question and before I pass it to you, Aziza, I think Aziza made some really important points. Is that the population that she's serving is probably the most vulnerable. It's the elderly, and it's the elderly and children that we're seeing great needs for food and other items, which which tells us a lot about our food system, which because I'm serving American Indian populations in some of the most rural parts of America and sometimes not. But the point is like there are inequities in our food system that is leaving our most vulnerable populations at risk for food shortages. And I said that slow because I want everybody on this call to think about what that means. That means that there are people in this country who are not privy to the food supply chain or the food surplus, however you want to view that food system, they're not privy to that system. And they're actually at the end of these food systems, and our food system is not serving them. And so what that should tell us is that we really need to rethink what kind of food system we're serving or what food system that we really want in the future. And so, yes, I think most of the populations that I work with for sure have needs, right? There's entire spans of communities who don't have protein right now. There's entire spans of communities who, yeah, you know what, they need diapers. And this is not just American Indian communities. These are communities who are at the end of the economic supply chains. And then when we think about the economics of food, and we think about who those economics serve, you're going to have entire communities that, I mean, Aziza uses the term like the poverty line level, but even that in itself to me sometimes is inadequate because you may be above the poverty line, but you still can't afford food. You may, and that's something that we don't always account for in these metrics about who is food insecure and who is not, because all these food metrics are based on the economics, the dollar economics, the cash economy economics that don't serve everybody in this country. And it's actually based on the exploitation of people in this country. If you're working night and day, 40 hours, if not overtime, and you can't afford to feed a family of 4, our economic system is off. And so my ask of the people in the audience is if you're not hungry, I think we have to count our blessings because I'm not hungry, but I make it a point to know about communities or people in my own community who are, because I need to understand how the systems that we operate in either serve or don't serve them, or don't serve me or maybe not them, but understanding the kinds of systems and the kind of supply chains that are leaving people out of our food economic system is really important for all of us to understand. And it may take a while to figure out who that is, or it may take a while to figure out why it doesn't happen. It may take you years to think about theories, and or even maybe it just takes you a few weeks. But the point is like we all need to start reevaluating what kind of food system we're participating in and trying to figure out who it serves and who it does not. Aziza, I'll pass it to you.
Aziza, you're still on mute. Sorry. I know.
I'm sorry.
Okay. You're fine. You're fine.
So what have I been hearing from people that we serve? Everyone is very grateful. the seniors, the kids. I love seeing, I don't see many children, but when I do, they're so excited because they get to pick out the food that they like, and we have the food that they like, the cereals that they want. But is the people, there are so many. When we did the first everybody eats, I love the older generation was excited. They were happy because they don't get that. And even a quick story, even going to the stores, there were 4 corner stores, and our volunteers had to use the restroom. Okay. It was a Indian store, it was a Asian store, and these are all food places in our communities. And I asked every store if our volunteers could use the restroom. None of the stores would let our volunteers use the restroom. Yet these stores are being supported by the people in the community. These stores sell goods in the community, yet would not allow the people in the community to use that, people that are helping their community to use the restroom, so that we can continue to help their community. There was one place, it was a Black-owned business that let us use their restroom, and it was because they said, "You're doing such a great job. You're helping out our community. You're helping out our people. Yes, you can use it." But what I've been hearing mostly what I've been hearing, of course, is gratitude. And not that that's not why we do it. We don't do it for the feedback. We do it because I think it's our job as human beings to help out other human beings, and that's just period. It's just period. It's our job as humans to help out humans, regardless. And like A-dae said, even if you're above the poverty level, buying groceries, I don't understand why groceries have gone up so much during the pandemic, during a time when people aren't really working, during a time where, people are losing their jobs. Even with unemployment doesn't give you what you make. Unemployment gives you a percentage of what you make, but yet prices in grocery stores are going up higher. Toilet paper, essentials, necessities are higher. So how do you expect people to be able to maintain food or anything in their homes right now that couldn't maintain them before? And it's sad. And I mean, on one aspect, I understand, because a lot of these farmers, being as restaurants are closed right now, so a lot of food isn't being ordered. Food isn't being ordered as much as they used to be. So they have to jack their prices up in order for them to survive. But it's hurting the average person. It's hurting our senior citizens. It's hurting our families that on a regular basis couldn't afford it. So we're here to help. We're here to help. So I'm happy that we can help, but I think that we need to do more. I think that we should do more, especially for especially for our seniors. I'm sorry, I'll keep going back to seniors because they really need it. They really, really do. And it pulls on my heartstrings to know, to see what they're going through, and to know what they're going through. It hurts. I wouldn't want my grandparents or parents going through anything like that.
Aziza, you bring up a great point, and I think it's something that has gotten missed in some conversations about knowing people who are experiencing these issues and being part of a community that does. And A-dae, you brought this up at the beginning when you were speaking about the food assistance that was coming in from the outside, and it's very far removed from the people who are driving 25 miles to the store and then finding that there's nothing there. The supply chain is massive, and so therefore there's very little connection, an emotional connection, to understand what it actually means to deal with hunger firsthand. And so when we're thinking about this food system, even though maybe it sounds corny and I'm having a hippy dippy moment, there is an emotional and personal aspect to that, because it's, unless you're starting to see other people as people who are hungry, as individuals who are hungry, it can be easy to just band-aid it over with surplus going elsewhere.
And I think I'm just going to respond to that because I think you make an important point. The reason I think Aziza and your comment are really important is because you're both explaining the importance of relationship. So we're talking to an audience in Philadelphia, and I know some of those communities are very old. A lot of them are and you're in an urban setting, and being somebody who doesn't really live in the urban setting, like I see stark differences between American Indian communities and our brothers and sisters who live in cities. And a lot of times city folk, and please, people in the audience, you can totally slam me in chat. I won't be upset, but it's hard to know your neighbors when you live in a city. It's hard to understand what everyone's needs are because you have the same access to like the same grocery store. You have like jobs that maybe take you out of your neighborhood. And so the relationships between people in your community are sometimes, challenged. Sometimes you don't always know who your neighbors are. But that's the key to like alternative economies, because that's the only way you know when people are in need is if you know them, if you know their names, and if you know that they're elderly and they can't make it to the store, or you know that they have 4 kids and they don't have jobs that are going to adequately supply their food with family with food. Like those are the things that we need to know about one another. And that's really what makes community, because then we're able to shift resources to those communities. And it's not based on cash. So the reason the cash economy is so damaging sometimes is because it's all based on numerical inputs, right? If your annual salary is attached to you and that's all people know about you, there's very little we can do to actually move resources to you when you're in need. All we can do is like see your uptick in your income or your downtick in your income. We don't really have any other indicators to tell us what your needs are. And that's, to me, that's the damage of the cash economy, because it's all based on numbers. And really it doesn't tell us much about needs. And actually the numbers are not always that accurate. Like when we have poverty lines that really are probably a farce, because there's people who live above poverty lines who are still hungry. Like these mainstream indicators don't tell us about our community. They don't tell us who's hungry. They don't tell us when somebody didn't have a meal today. And yes, they do like maybe scratch the surface about who may be hungry or what neighborhoods are in need of resources, like a little bit. But really, the relationships that we have with people are the most important. And so Aziza's work, like knowing the names of the elders who are taking care of their grandchildren, is really important. That's like the only way we can start really challenging what we know about our current food systems and our current supply chains. Is like we got to put names to faces and faces to need in order to respond to them. And the last thing I'll say before, like, I know I'm hogging the mic, but the last thing I'll say is like, that's the one thing we learned in Indigenous communities, is that our current system, like we have huge inadequacies because we have buildup in places, right? When we see pictures of soy and corn being dumped in like the Midwest, or we see like pictures of potatoes like we saw in the COVID, like being piled up and moldy, it's because there's a surplus somewhere, which shouldn't be happening when there's a need, like in the Indian country. But because we are based on a cash economy and we're just looking at numbers, those things don't get addressed. And if we think of like natural economics, for example, the economics of our environment, if we saw like a buildup of trees or a buildup of like animals in a certain places, like our first instinct is to think, why are they building up in this place? Why are they not moving? Why are they not migrating? Why are these trees just growing here and not other places? And we would respond. But in an economy that's all based on numbers, it's hard to do that.
And A-dae, you've actually opened a space for me to ask a question that came from an attendee who was thinking about what you said about living outside a cash economy. And this person says that they're trying to expand their thinking to envision what other economies could look like, and asks if you could share examples to help us visualize what an alternative non-cash economy could look like. It's a big question.
It is, but I think it's a very like simple one in many respects, because economy is a way to a community manages resources. And again, if we're only looking at like the numbers and people's incomes and the prices of things, it's not telling us much about our economy, right? But that's what people think is like, that's a cash economy, that's capitalism. But I challenge everybody on here to start living outside of that. And how do we do that? Well, my grandma and grandpa are farmers, right? And every year we had an excess of corn. And instead of letting that corn go bad, you know what we did? We would take it to our neighbors. And you're living in urban Philadelphia, probably. Look in your cabinets, look in your closet, and if there's an excess of something you have, whether it be material, whether it be toys, whether it be clothes, like take it to your neighbor and see what they have in access that they can trade with you. Like, it's not like really a hard task to live outside the cash economy, because we all have access of something, even if it's time that we can give to somebody else, and in return we would get something in exchange. You know, like I see people in urban settings doing this all the time with like jams, right? There's women who like make all kinds of tomato sauce when it's tomato season, and they trade those with their neighbors. Like, that's the first step into really challenging how we think about how food moves and how resources move in our own neighborhoods, in hopes that those actions can then have ripple effects into our larger economic system.
And A-dae, thank you for articulating that. And I think that what you're saying is describing in a certain way what Everybody Eats is trying to do. It's about mutual aid. It's about people providing for other people. I mean, Aziza, you can tell us more, but I don't think that you started with a big budget or lots of donations from larger food corporations in order to start giving things out, right?
No, actually, the first Everybody Eats was done in 2 days. and we were actually just going to do sandwiches, but being as though we're in the industry, and there are 5 of us in the group, we reached out to other restaurants, and they then made food, donated food. Farmers or purveyors, they donated food, because if it's helping the community, they want to be a part of it. You know, for the most part, especially small businesses, because we know how it is to need and to struggle. You know, so no, we didn't have a budget. We were all just going to come out of our pockets, which for us is fine. Our thing is we want to help people, you know, and that's it. We want to help people. At the beginning of the pandemic, when all the restaurants closed and we couldn't work, I know personally, I was just like, well, I'm going to die if I stay in the house. I can't stay in the house and not do anything. That's just me. So what can I do for the children that only eat in school? You know, what can I do and honestly, that was my first focus, was the kids. I didn't know about the senior citizens, you know. I just knew about the kids, and what can I do to help them, because I was contracted to a school to help them with their kitchen. And I saw that was my first time seeing, that was in 2017, how there are, and I knew before, but don't you know how you know something, but you aren't a part of it? Like you don't actually, become a part of it until, or you may not ever become a part of it. It's just like, yeah, I know people are hungry, but I'll donate to this organization. And what's so funny is earlier this year, I said, I haven't volunteered at a nonprofit, but instead we started one. We started, instead of volunteering, what we wound up doing is just starting one, because now it's instead of, and I'll still help out at other nonprofits, but it's like, I tell people, don't talk about it, be about it. If you want to be a part of something, if you want to fix something, if you want to help with something, don't talk about it. A lot of people do a lot of talking, and not a lot of people have a lot of action behind their talk, so I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought.
No, that's okay. I think that if we ever need to start making T-shirts, we're going to say, don't talk about it, be about it, and like share the message. When we talked, when we three talked before, when we were preparing for this, A-dae, you promised that you were going to go deep, and I figured, you know what, let's just go deep. Let's talk about some of the roots of this, because Aziza, you're talking about elders in Philadelphia, and I know that you're working in West Philadelphia, North Philadelphia, and parts of South Philadelphia, where there is a high level of poverty. There's also it's also Black neighborhoods in Philadelphia and BIPOC communities in Philadelphia where there is this need. And in tribal communities and in Indian country, there's a similar need, and it doesn't take too much of a stretch of the imagination to understand that there is underlying racism that is feeding a lot of the problems that you both are working to solve. Native Americans and Black and African Americans were exploited to build the US food economy, right? Native Americans were violently separated from their land, and a lot of the produce that they grew and the way that they knew how to work with the land was either taken from them or was destroyed in the process. Enslaved Africans and their descendants were exploited for their labor on the farm, and then for generations afterward were prevented or it made extremely difficult for them to own land and own their own means of production to produce food. So these, Native people, BIPOC folks, they're still being exploited in the US economy and in the food economy in particular. They're saddled with cheap and nutrient poor calories that contribute to chronic disease. That's a deep setting to start to ask you both to talk a little bit about if you're seeing that history of exploitation play out in your own communities, and what you've seen that's been inspiring or hopeful to reverse that history and that legacy of exploitation. Told you I'd go deep.
Aziza, do you want to go first? Or would you like me to go first?
I can go first. Some things, so in a lot of Black neighborhoods, what I've noticed are, of course, a lot more fast food places. Literally on almost every single corner, there is a Chinese store. Whereas where I go, when I'm in the suburbs, you barely see, if you see any, Chinese stores. And not the Chinese restaurants or Asian restaurants. I'm talking about the corner stores where you get fried food and the chips and the sodas and iced teas, all the good fattening stuff, all the saturated fats and carbohydrates and salts and whatnot. And even like the liquor stores. And I've noticed this growing up. In where I live, and I noticed, and then when I moved out of well, actually, I was born in West Philly. Then we moved up to Cheltenham. My parents wanted us to have a better school. But we moved in a Black community. We moved in Lamont, which is predominantly Black in Cheltenham. And we still have, you know, across the street, the stores, the chips, all the junk food that you can get. But the further you go into Cheltenham, the less you don't see those stores as much. Most of your fatty junk foods are in the market. They're in the supermarket. They're not at the corner store. They're not at every single corner that you go to. One way that we can fix this is for our communities, for us in the community, to get more involved with what's being sold in our communities. And I've heard that over the years, but I think now, I think, you know, there are more young people, there are more of the X generation or the Y, this new generation that want to change, and that desires, that craves a change for that, you know, and it can happen. It just takes us to do it. I was watching a movie a few weeks ago. It was a movie that came out in the early 90s, and how they market certain things for certain communities. And I mean, we all know this. It's not, I'm assuming we all know this. You know, how how it was a beer that they was going to put signs all over in a Black community, and they wasn't putting it in the white communities. And we see that a lot, and we still see it, and it's so unfortunate that is happening. It'll take it'll I keep losing my train of thought because my mind is moving so fast. But yeah, I keep losing my train of thought. You know what, A-dae, I'm just gonna let you take it.
I got you, Aziza. I got
Thank you.
Yes. I'm just gonna piggyback on what Aziza said, like, because I don't think people really understand the history of this country.
Oop, we lost your sound, A-dae. Sorry. I don't want to miss your words.
Okay, got it better? Yes, okay. So I know we only have a few minutes, so I will keep this brief.
No,
Aziza.
We've got time. Okay. You take your time. You got it.
Aziza made an important point. One is that we see the kind of food that is in Black and Indigenous communities, which is high fat, high salt, high dense calorie, pretty unhealthy food, right? And you see this all in low income communities, and that's by design. So when we look at the history of our food system, there's 2 points that need to be remembered, and I hope if you leave the audience that you remember these things. We see a lot of civil unrest in our country that's based on social and racial inequity, and that begins with our food system, right? Some of the first militias that we see in this country that eventually became sanctified police departments were used to keep slaves either on plantations or Indians on reservations. And that was all to support this food economy that was being then extracted, whatever that product was being extracted, and the value being sent to Europe. And so a lot of what we see today began when we saw the American food system in its inception. The second thing is when we really see this idea of nutrition and food science come into play in America, it was during the late 1800s, when the military was still having hand-to-hand combat, and there was a lot of hunger in America. And so the military had skinny soldiers, skinny, weak soldiers who are malnutritioned. And so Professor Atwater and a woman named Ellen Richards, they created this thing called food science, nutrition. And it was based on the idea that in order to have better soldiers, you needed high fat, high salt, high calorie content in order to create bigger soldiers. And then you see that same diet being basically reformed in communities where they have high military admission. And so like it's by design that we see some of these foods in communities that have high military participation. And if you don't believe me, you can go look up food science and the history of nutrition all by yourself. It's like Ellen Richards actually created the crock pot too, because she wanted these communities who couldn't afford good food to at least be able to make their food palatable, high salt, high fat, and dense calories to become more palatable. So she created the crock pot. And all of these things play into our American food system and are still at play today. And so when we think about the civil unrest and the racial unrest, and we think about the uptick in food-related diseases, a lot of it has to do with the exploitation that began with the American food system in the beginning. Like you said it before, Molly, like indigenous people were taken off their land because one of the first extractive resources was the topsoil in the American landscape. And then it eventually became people, right? You know, like then slaves were brought in to actually support that system, because you couldn't have high labor costs if you wanted cheap products to send to Europe. And so all of these things are at play when we talk about the consequences of those systems. American Indian people and our uptick in food-related diseases are the consequences. Neighborhoods that are filled with corner grocery stores that have the same diet that they fed the military when there was malnutrition are the consequences of our food system. And like, it's nice to think about our food system and going to the grocery store and buying like a nice muffin with nice packaging, and we can feel good about like having a better diet because we're eating better products. But are we really, or are we still perpetuating a food system that exploited people from the beginning, and are people still being exploited? And it's like, I'm totally being a Debbie Downer, but that's the way we got to start thinking when we're thinking about re-envisioning what our food system and what our country needs to be.
And also going to about the, let's say, the corner grocery stores and lower income communities. If you look at the prices in those stores as compared to the prices in supermarket, they're almost twice as much in those stores. You're paying almost twice as much in the corner store for product than you would be in the supermarket a lot of times. I hate going to the corner store to get any product, because a can of beans that would usually cost 79 cents or 99 cents at the supermarket is $2 and some change. And what I don't understand is, why are groceries that high in communities that don't make as much money? And it's not just groceries, it's gas as well. I've seen it with gas. Gas will be 40 cents higher in a lower income part of the city than it is in a higher income part of the city. You know, so it's yes, it's still being exploited. Yes, we're still being exploited, and it's not right. You know, the next thing is, what are we going to do about it? What will we do about it? What will all of us do about it? Because it doesn't just take, you know, us, it takes everyone to fix this.
And I want to get to the what do we do about it, because we like to end these on like a, you know, a day, no such thing as a Debbie Downer, right? But you know, we'll end in a moment on like thinking about what we can do. But I wanted to bring up what A-dae said, which is really important, that some of this has been designed over time, and it is a natural outcome. Not necessarily it had to be this way, but it's a natural outcome of some of the things that have happened much earlier. And Aziza, when you brought up in Philadelphia, for those of you who are tuning in from outside of the region, we call them stop and goes, and they're corner stores that, exactly like Chef Z said, They've got fried food, packaged food, sodas, tobacco products sometimes, often flavored tobacco products, which are often marketed to kids. And the people who own them typically will put up like a very thick piece of plexiglass that is separating them from the people who are coming into the store. And they're primarily, there's some all over the place in Philadelphia, but there is a greater concentration of them in our low-income communities, in our communities of color, and sometimes they are owned by people who are new Americans. They or who are maybe one or two generations removed from an immigrant family, and it's pitting people of color against people of color in a small community where everyone is trying to fight for resources, but that the existence of those stores in the first place is due to generations of policies and real estate decisions and redlining decisions that have now led to these certain neighborhoods looking one way and other neighborhoods looking in a different way. And the amount of control people have over their environment. So Aziza, I like that you said that about how can younger people or anybody start to have more say in their neighborhood, in their community. How can they be more present? That probably feels like a to-do in terms of looking at how we can think differently about our very local food supply chain. And I want to talk about the other what can we do's in a moment, but anything that we haven't touched on that either of you feel like we really need to make sure the folks who are tuning in can hear from you.
Wait, so are we on the like what do we do about it question now, or like
the what can we do, or if there's anything else that I haven't talked about or I haven't asked you a question about but that you were really hoping I would ask, you can give that answer too.
Well, I think I'll jump to the what can we do about it, just because people don't always recognize the importance of community gardens. But I recently heard a story today, and one of the stories was that when and American Indian people did this too, which is why I'm bringing this up, is when some of the slaves were brought from Africa, the women would braid their hair and they would actually put seeds into the braids as a way to carry them to the new lands. And so when they came to America and were enslaved by, probably working a plantation that probably grew some food source or cotton source or something that went into the American economy, the women would take these seeds and they would plant them near their homes, and they would have their own community gardens where they controlled what grew from the ground. And I bring that up because when we look in our communities and we see a community garden, we shouldn't be thinking like, oh, that's just like a little community garden. And, when is it going to get bigger? Or when are you going to start having products that actually get into the food economy? Like the fact that there's a community garden in some of the places that are most urban or some of the most, I guess, impoverished communities is a sign of resilience. And so to me, like what we need to do is we need to plant more community gardens. And the same thing happened when American Indian people were removed from their lands. They took seeds and they sewed them into their clothes so that when they got to the new lands, they would plant those gardens. And so I know during COVID, we saw a whole bunch of social media posts saying, I don't know, what did they call them? Community resiliency gardens. But, to me, those are gardens of hope. Those are gardens of future. And those are like deep connections to who we are and from where we come from. Is the planting of those seeds is really important. And anybody knows who gardens or anybody knows who does any food system work. When you plant a seed, like there's something hopeful in that action.
Good point. That is a great point. Philadelphia does have a few. We can definitely have more. And there is a nice garden around the corner from where I live. I think also what we can do, and what I definitely will start doing, is food education. You know, you can't experiment or eat or grow what you don't know. And it needs to start young. You know, I mean, of course we will talk to everyone, but we also need to talk to our children, the community children, and we need to get back into the community. You know, like you said, A-dae, we're in a city. We need to know our neighbors. You know, when people knew their neighbors, there was a lot more caring going on. I don't see a lot now. Yeah, people are caring. People care since COVID has happened, but more caring as far as getting to know your neighbor again, getting to know your neighbor down the street. Because by you getting to know your neighbor down the street, by you planting the food garden in your neighborhood, by us wanting to educate so that there's more of a food security in the neighborhood, less junk food. And junk food, when I say junk food, I'm not just talking about chips. You know, I'm talking about the fast food, just the non-healthy food that goes into your body, and just simple ways to cook food. Chef Kurt, he's one of the chefs in Everybody Eats. He has, he started this cooking, Cook That Joint. And what he's doing is he's making videos of care packages that people get, and showing people how to cook them. And these are things that you can get from the dollar store. These are things that are given in the boxes that people receive from organizations like Everybody Eats or Feel Abundance or Share Express. They also help Everybody Eats out. Share Express also does that. Or Bonafide Giving. He shows you how to cook, or not just him and other chefs show you how to cook some of these dishes, some of the ingredients that are in these boxes. And I just think food knowledge will help a lot, you know, and that will go into, you know, centers being open, community centers being back open, cooking classes, and because they took those out of school, cooking classes, home economics, there you go, home ec. Being put back in school to teach the children how to feed themselves and to feed their parents and to feed their grandparents, and what not to eat, you know, what can help them. Because if you have these small things like a can of beans and a can of beans, 79-cent can of beans, and a 99-cent up to $3.25 pound of ground turkey, can go a long way, you know. And if you have those farms, those neighborhood farms that A-dae are talking about, don't be afraid to go there. You know, don't be afraid to say, hey, I'm new, how can I help? Or what is this? Or what is that? You know, so those are, I just wanted to piggyback on what you were saying, A-dae. That's all.
And Aziza, you're talking about building community at the same time, right? I mean, it's about saying, going down the street and maybe talking to somebody that you've not talked to before, and asking them, what is that you're doing? And what I'm hearing from both of you is that there's some things that we can do within the current food supply chain. There's a lot of reasons to think outside of the current food supply chain and to start to build, and A-dae, you said this word at the beginning, resilience of those systems. And I think that idea of resilience, that word has gotten thrown around a lot in the past 7 months. But I think that understanding what true resilience looks like, time will tell what that actually means. Well, I want to thank you both for making the time to be here and for sharing your work and for sharing your vision. I think that you're both inspirational and a lot of fun. And I wish that we could have this conversation over a meal, but you know, maybe someday in a post-COVID world. And I want to thank everybody who joined us this evening. We are thrilled to be able to present these, thrilled to be able to offer them in 2 languages. We are going to make these videos and an audio version of this series available, and we'll send that out to anybody who signed up through our Eventbrite so that you can share it with people who you think might have their minds changed or broadened by thinking about the food supply chain a little bit differently. Thank you to Suzanna for managing all the tech. And in 2 weeks, on the 27th of October, we're going to have our next of these digital dialogues. You can use the same Eventbrite link to sign up and to join us then. In the meantime, stay healthy and stay well. Thank you for being here this evening. Aziza, thank you. A-dae, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Bye, everybody.